Hello, and welcome to Season 10, Episode 5 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading the Thomas Sowell Reader, this time finishing up the section on economics. A few longer articles in this one, more than what we're used to here. There were just 3 or 4 sections, but covered about 30 pages or so.
Yes.
But it was good. It was really good. Really interesting takes on how, especially this first article, on how people can be racist but not discriminate, and people can discriminate and not be racist just because they're doing what's in their best interests at a given time, is essentially his core argument here.
Correct.
You seem like you're going to be full of information this episode.
Full of piss and vinegar.
It's Christmas Eve as we're recording this, the 24th.
Yeah, I tend to get in a bad mood.
That's good.
Starting at Christmas Eve and lasting through Halloween.
I don't think you're going to get a bad mood. I think that's just your standard state.
No, I really am. I do get, they call it the holiday blues. So I do get that.
I see.
Yeah. So I have that now.
That's good. That'll make for a good episode.
I was doing well all the way through last night. Last night was fine.
Interesting.
And then I woke up this morning early, like in the middle of the night, a little after 4 o'clock, and couldn't go back to sleep. And I've been miserable ever since.
That's good.
And now we're
glad.
in the afternoon. And so I'm going to share my happiness with our listener.
That'll make for a great Christmas episode for whoever's listening.
Yes, Merry Christmas.
All right.
So what other thoughts do you have about the economics of discrimination?
I don't know.
You just summarized it. I find his arguments really fascinating because he takes an empirical approach to it, and it's like people think, and what his point was, as you so aptly summarized, which is just because you're racist doesn't mean you're discriminating in your hiring decisions or in housing decisions or whatever. And and people think, well, that can't be true. Of course it's true.
Yeah.
Just because just because I'm Catholic doesn't mean I would like to talk to Catholic people about religion. Doesn't mean I'm going to exclude and not talk to other people about things or that I care about their religion in other contexts. And so, there's a certain amount of logical sense that just because you have certain attitudes doesn't mean you're necessarily going to act on them.
Yeah.
Or that, you're going to take an action to your detriment just because you don't like people, and that's really a lot of what his point is. Yeah. but he's making an economic point, which is the discriminatory effect or the acts of discrimination can and are modified by certain costs, either societal costs, generally, or specific economic costs. I mean, if you can get a lot of cheap labor, like people that were just overtly racist, in a society that was overtly discriminatory against African Americans or any other type of subgroup, would still hire a bunch of African Americans to do work if they can get the work done at a certain price. And that's what really his point is that it's not, all this stuff is not in a vacuum.
Yeah. And he makes a good point early on, is like discrimination is like a very actual real thing, right? Like if you want to define this, like that's a physical thing that you can see. It's an actual action that somebody takes. And I think that's a good point, because I don't know if it's so much anymore, but maybe 4 or 5 years ago, like discrimination, I think was such a buzzword for such a long time that it's like, well, that person's being discriminatory, and when they're just meaning that person's being mean or racist generally or something like that. And it's like, well, that's like an actual action that you were taking. If you're discriminating against one person, like that should be a measurable thing that you're talking about, but it's just kind of thrown around. Yes. This came up. I listened to Michael Knowles' podcast pretty regularly, and he was talking. They tried to kick him off one of the campuses he was speaking on or something.
Yes.
And one of the complaints was that he was discriminatory against trans people or something like that, and that was one of the official complaints filed against him. And he's like, you could say what you want about what I think about the transgender issue or something like that, but I don't think there's any measured examples of me discriminating against them. Like, there's not a lot of people applying to work for my podcast. There's not a lot of people who are like trying to get in on these activities that I'm hosting who are trans and who I'm just denying because they're trans. Right?
Yes.
It's like, that is discrimination. Discrimination is not just this sort of ethereal thing that's just, person does bad thing, and therefore that's discrimination. That's something you measure.
Good point. And also, that's such a small subset of the population. It's unlikely that we will actually have to beat any of them up if they go into a girl's restroom, right?
Yeah.
That would be quote unquote discriminatory. Also, probably the proper thing to do if they're going to go in there, little girls are present. Not that I'm advocating violence, but you have to have a certain amount of physical force against. Physical deterrence against aberrant and deviant behavior. How do you like that for a Merry Christmas
That's
message?
a great Christmas Eve message there.
Well, what I liked, especially in kind of his introductory remarks, is he talked about the Arkansas senator, William Fulbright. He was talking about voting for or against civil rights legislations. He mentioned Senator William Fulbright, who voted against people like him voted against their consciences to continue racial segregation because to do otherwise would be to jeopardize their political careers. And so, of course, that begs the question, is it really their conscience that they're violating, or are they just malleable? But certainly they have would have espoused viewpoints which would not discriminatory, but would vote to continue it because of the political costs associated with it.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important to have first principles that you will not breach, whether it's convenient or not. But I don't know how many politicians have so many of those anyway. Yeah. So he puts it in those terms that here's a person that really felt that it was a wrong thing to do, but it was politically expedient. It seems to be what our leaders have been doing my entire life up until maybe 6 minutes ago, and we'll see how how it progresses with this new crop of people getting
we'll see.
Sworn in.
But he makes another good point on page 88, where it's the section titled Variations in Costs.
Yes.
He says, at one time there were said to be American railroads in which Catholics could rise only so high, and others in which this was true of Protestants.
Yes.
And the point he's making is, things aren't permanent with discrimination and racism. There's not one group that is, permanently like the lower group and has never, had prejudice against another group, and they're always the ones being beaten down. There's always been one oppressor and one oppressed. Like, that's just not true. These things are in flux throughout history, and that's something that a lot of people, I think, forget today, is that they like to box people into these neat little categories, like you are always the oppressed, you are always the oppressor, but that's just not the case.
It really isn't, and I think it's just born out of ignorance.
Yeah.
Because so few people even know American history prior to their lifetime.
Yeah.
And I was talking at lunch today with some people that are, about a couple of them were about your age. And, just trading stories about, not even trading stories, just telling them stories about the old days. Yeah. And one of them was saying they were astounded that cable television remotes were corded. Like you had a cord that would go to the TV, which of course we did. And of course, I lived in a time before cable TV, and I lived in a time where you had basically like 5 stations, and you flip the dial. And so there's so much that has happened, and so much has changed just in my lifetime. And then you think back, hundreds of years, who is oppressing who, depending on which era they're in, or which geographic area, who was stronger at the time and who was weaker. And, the world's been extremely brutal. You look back at some of these battles where you have a civilizational destruction, of people. They'd conquer them. They'd kill anybody who survived the battle, who was a man of military age. They just slaughter them all. Yeah. And then they sell the women and children into slavery. That kind of puts into perspective our disputes about raising the debt limit.
That's true. That's a good point.
Or the riot on January 6th, 2020. Was it 2021?
It was 21, yeah. Almost 4 years ago now.
Yes.
I like this example he gives of Poland between the world wars, where he says, an absolute majority of all physicians in private practice were from the Jewish minority, which was only 10% of the population. Yet the Polish government did not hire Jewish physicians, though many other Poles obviously became patients of Jewish physicians in the private sector, or else so many Jewish doctors could not have made a living. And essentially, the argument he makes here is that the incentives for the regular people to discriminate, or the disincentives to discriminate, were not present for the government, because it would have been cheaper for these people to go to Jewish doctors and to go to them in private practice. But the government doesn't have to care about those costs and all of those other assorted things, so that they can discriminate against Jewish doctors and not hire them within the government because they don't have any of the associated costs. And essentially the argument is like, we kind of see, or some people kind of see the government as like a neutral party, but that's not the case. In some instances, the government can be more discriminatory than just the free market.
Well, and I think he was making that point, but he's also making the other point, which is that society, the dominant society, they were prejudiced against the Jews.
Yes,
they didn't like the Jews, and as a matter of public policy, they said we're not going to employ you, Jews. Mm-hmm. But when their kid would get sick, they'd go to the Jewish doctor because they're the best doctors. They happen to be, because of training and experience or whatever, and so they were overlooking that discriminatory attitude, which was in law between the wars, and so because there were different costs associated with, I'll overlook my hatred of them as a people to go to this particular person to get better medical care. I wasn't aware of those statistics before reading this, so I'm taking his word for it, but it seems to make sense, and also reminds us of the prejudice that existed in Poland before the Nazis took over and had the camps there, so there was some overlap there. And the attitudes against the Jews in Europe, which I think helped facilitate the Nazis being able to accomplish so much in such little time throughout Europe, including France and all that kind of stuff. But that's a different kind of discrimination. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, he just makes he talks about that and what were the other examples? I'm trying to remember, but
he gives the example of baseball. I guess he's a big baseball fan.
Yeah,
the second time this has come up. But essentially, he's saying Major League Baseball was a cartel exempted from most antitrust laws up until a certain point.
Yeah, it is.
Which is really funny. But he says this changed in 1947 when the Brooklyn Dodgers hired Jackie Robinson as the first black Major League player. And he kind of points this as an example where it was more cost effective to just not be racist or not to be discriminatory,
but still racist.
But still racist, right. Because it would have been worse for those other teams if they just stuck with white players, because they were realizing that the black players were many times more successful and more talented.
Because you're excluding an entire population. Surely the highest achievers there are going to be better than the achievers of a different racial group.
Yeah, and I think he makes the point. Where was it at? That. Yeah, it was for a period of 7 consecutive years, no white man won the National League's Most Valuable Player Award. And so he said if none of those other teams had expanded, to hire black people, all of those people would have been on the Brooklyn Dodgers and they'd have been an unstable team for those 7 years. And so it just made economic sense for those other teams, even if they were racist, to not discriminate.
Yes.
So he's saying, there's not a one-to-one tie of racism to discrimination in these societies, that sometimes it's just the free market can do away with discrimination even if people themselves are racist.
Yes.
No, I thought it was a great point.
Yes, and it's such an interesting point because it takes the morality out of the discussion to a large extent. You're looking at what are the incentives and disincentives. Now, some of it's political because, it was mentioned the politician because there's certain political costs. But he's trying to emphasize that, depending on how you have it all structured and how much freedom you have in the economy, you may be incentivizing discrimination or you can disincentivize it and still end up with a proper result, even if there's a large group of people who are racist. It doesn't mean, it doesn't necessarily reflect what's in their heart. And so then what is it? Then the question is, okay, as a matter of public policy, what do I care about more?
Yeah.
Trying to convert them, like a religious a conversion, or to create a more equal and open playing field so everybody is treated equally no matter how much you hate each other.
Yeah.
Because there's always going to be people that hate groups of people or have those kind of prejudices one way or the other.
Yeah.
And so he's not making that broader point in particular in this article, but I think it definitely supports that.
Oh, absolutely.
Want to move on to, let's see. He talks about the markets too. I don't know if we want to see.
Yeah, not too much. I mean, I think we got the main points in that article there.
He goes on to some detail. Everything he writes, I keep saying, is just fantastic. Well, he does mention, like, the economic system and how he makes the argument that there was better black employment in the Deep South than there was during Jim Crow than there was in the North, mainly due to unionization efforts and the cost of labor. Yeah. Basically, they're priced out of the market in the North, where they weren't in the South, because the wages were relatively lower in the South because they were not unionized. Yeah. And so if everybody is cheap labor, then the African American population was able to be employed based upon their skills more effectively than if there was an artificial restriction of the labor supply and increasing the price of it. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting concept. Of course, it didn't help with the race that the unions themselves are racist and just locked out the blacks from getting a job. That's true. On threat of violence, and he alludes to that too, for sure, as well.
Yeah, this next article was also really interesting. Income distribution is the title. And this one was great because he says, the first sentence: variations in income can be viewed empirically on the one hand, or in terms of moral judgments on the other. Most of the contemporary intelligentsia do both. And this whole article was essentially talking about how you can manipulate statistics to make your own moral arguments, regardless of whether those are empirical conclusions. Oftentimes the statistics we hear are just the carefully selected ones that prove whoever's point or whatever point the person was trying to make before they even looked at the statistics.
Yes. But more specifically, he's making the point about how really the news media and a lot of economists talk about income disparity. And that and I remember, I think he's the one that clued me into this many years ago, reading articles similar to this one, where he emphasizes, especially in the United States, how people have a real significant income disparity over time. Like their path, the wealthy can become very poor very quickly. Where you lose it all and you go down the bottom rung, and then you can climb back up and you move over this way. And then he also makes the point about how the people that are when you're looking at income, because that's what people say. Well, the top 1%, make so much more than the bottom 20% or whatever in income. Well, income is different than assets, number one. So, if I have all the assets that, like we were at Grant's Farm, which was partly of the Anheuser-Busch estate at one time, and now it's like run by a charity or whatever. And there's a big, beautiful building there. If you have that big, beautiful building and all the supplies you could possibly consume for the next 2 years, you don't need income. Yeah. You have the assets. And so you have that. And then another thing that he points out so well is that, when you're young and you're starting out, you're going to start out at the lower end of the income scheme of things. You'll be down at the bottom. And then as you work and you develop your skills and your abilities, and you make more money and more opportunities, then by the time your retirement age, you're towards the top, the top fifth or whatever. So people move, and they move up and down, especially with regard to income. And so it's not necessarily such an important measure to say what's the income disparity between these, because he likes to look at the statistics about where people move over time, the same people.
Exactly. And that's a really good point, because he says, if you're looking at, Census Bureau data, that's like blocks of the population. That's where you hear the top, 1% of earners, it's just this category. But those aren't the same top 1% from the past, 10 years. The last time you took that census. Right. It's largely a different group of people.
Yes.
He says Data on those who were among the top 400 income earners from 1992 to 2000 were not data on the same 400 people throughout the span of time covered. During that span, there were thousands of people in the top 400,
Yes.
which is to say turnover was high. So it's like if you actually look at it per capita, or per person, that's just, people moving into different categories. It's
Yes.
not the same 400 people who are just making, 10 times more money over the past decade. No, it's different people moving into those groups, and those same people fall back out later on, maybe in the span of just 2 or 3 years.
Yes.
So looking at it as if those blocks are the same and will always be the same forever, same group of people, is just completely incorrect.
Yeah, and if that is malleable or changeable over time, it's less of an issue that there is this income disparity between the highs and lows, because if you're low here, you might be high later, and some of that is going to average out. I'm not saying everything averages out, but and then I really love I think it was the final point he makes, which is that those statistics never include the government subsidies, which are food stamps or whatever they call them now, and housing subsidies, and like there's an entire. This is not widely discussed, but it's going to have to be, especially if we're talking about the budget, the people on disability.
Yeah.
Because once you're on disability for a certain period of time, then you're on Medicare. Even though you're not old enough to qualify for Medicare, you're on Medicare. Medicare is different than Medicaid. So you get free health care, and then you're going to also be eligible for housing subsidies, subsidized housing. So and you get a stipend.
Yeah.
So you get a stipend, you get housing subsidies, you get free food, and free health care. And so that's why when people go onto disability, it's so hard to convince them to get off, because it's going to be a pay cut.
Yeah.
If they're able to physically,
and that's not counted as income.
Correct.
That's just not considered, as part of their income.
It's because it's not income to them. It's just government benefits that cost us. And so, as he points out, if you're in that bottom sector, they're actually undercounting their income by like 2/3, I think. Depending on the person and the amount of actual benefits they have.
Yeah.
And then there's nowadays with so many programs, even since he's written this, the multiplier effect with all these kind of subsidies, and then of course you have the earned income tax credit for those that are not reporting a significant income tax liability, meaning they don't have a lot of taxable income, possibly because they're working for cash, but then there's a direct cash transfers or earned income tax credit is going to have to be looked at, because that's really just a tax. That's just a payment. It's it's in the form of a tax refund, but they never paid taxes. They just get a direct transfer of wealth. I don't know if you're familiar with that concept, but it's a significant payment to people who do not have significant reportable taxable income. So when you look at all these transfers and benefits. We're all a lot closer than what we're told by the news media and those advocates for doing whatever they're. I don't even know what they're advocating for today or this week, other than murdering CEOs. But he just makes such a good argument about, especially the key thing for me was, and it really was news to me when I first read him many years ago on this subject, about how people, it's such common sense, but you don't think of it, that from one year to the next, people are going to be on a different scale on that income.
Well, this statistic I thought was great. He says more than 3/4 of those working Americans whose incomes were in the bottom 20% in 1975 were also in the top 40% of income earners at some point by 1991.
Yes.
Only 5% of those who were initially in the bottom quintile were still there in 1991, while 29% of those who were initially at the bottom quintile had risen to the top quintile. And he says, yet verbal virtuosity has transformed a transient cohort in a given statistical category into an enduring class called the poor.
Yep.
And that's a really great point. I think throughout this whole chapter is just how you frame things. You can make a group called the poor, even if the poor doesn't exist. It's a group of people who's changing throughout time. It's not the same, 500,000 people who are just stuck there forever. It's just not the case.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember if this is... Did you talk about the household income statistics? Because He also mentioned, I don't know if it was in this article, it was one of the other ones. There's a big difference in how if you look at household incomes, well, that all depends on the size of the household.
Yeah.
So that's a big difference in the statistics now from when I was born in 1970, because there's so many more single parent households. And so, I like to quip when people try to hire me to represent them on divorces, and I absolutely refuse, mainly because nobody wins a divorce, and I don't want to lose cases. But the other thing is everybody loses in a divorce because you're taking, even just economically, you're taking, if it's just one earner, but you're doubling the home expenses, just to live, your living expenses double because you're now in separate households. And so the per capita income may be the same, but the household income is going to halve because now you've doubled the household.
Yeah.
Because you have now two households. You have the husband here and the wife there. If they're never married, if you're just single on your own, and there's so many more of those than there were, a generation or two ago.
Yeah.
That skews the statistics.
Yeah, because he does mention that here. He says there are 39 million people in households whose incomes are in the bottom 20%, but there are 64 million people in households whose incomes are in the top 20%.
Yes.
There's just more people in those higher earning households. And then he also says, but if every person in the entire country received exactly the same income, there would still be a significant disparity, in quotes, between the average incomes received by households containing 64 million people compared to the average incomes received by households containing 39 million people. There's just more people. If everybody earned the same amount, the houses with more people would just have more money. And that would be a disparity, but it's not necessarily the case that each household or that each person is earning has a disparity. Yeah.
Right. Because it's looking at, it's confusing the cause of that disparity. You say, this is just because there's some discrimination, or because there's some perversion in the capitalist system. Well, maybe, but it could just be that there's more people on this category numerically than the other. And you may be talking about people that are younger in the lower categories. And then there's all the other factors about, not working and committing crimes and doing drugs and stuff like that, which is a contributing factor to all that stuff. And of course, inherited wealth is a factor that, as far as wealth, and then you could, if you have the more wealth you have, the more income you can generate. You can convert wealth, assets into income in various ways too.
And I do like what he says just here at the kind of the end section of this article about the moral considerations. He kind of makes fun of this author. Michael Harrington's best-selling book, The Other America, for example, dramatized income statistics, lamenting the anguish of the poor in America, tens of millions maimed in body and spirit, constituting the shame of the other America, people caught in a vicious cycle, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But essentially going back to that other point, it's like that group of people, the poor, may not actually exist. Right? It's not the same tens of millions of people who are constantly in anguish and these words that he uses to describe these people. You're describing a statistical block. You're not describing individuals. If you looked at the individuals, you would see more shifts between groups, and people would be working themselves out of poverty. And unfortunately, some other people fall into poverty from where they were before. And so it's like we use this very heightened language, talking about these statistical groups, but we might not be talking about actual people. We're just talking about a block of statistics.
Yes, and it's it would make more sense to use that analysis that author uses if there's a caste system. Like India, that if you can't, you can't get out of this caste. You are not eligible to, have these things or these jobs or whatever. That makes a lot more sense because you're describing reality. But when people are able to move up and down the income scale over time, it makes a lot less sense.
Yeah, but for sure. Any other thoughts on that article?
No. We can go on to the next boogeyman that he loves to talk about, which is minimum wage laws. Yeah. And he correctly points out that politicians, he kind of says this as an aside, politicians like to let inflation remove the effectiveness of minimum wage laws. Because as inflation goes up, if you don't raise the minimum wage, it becomes irrelevant. And it doesn't have any effect on the economy anymore because the minimum wage is below the minimum wage anybody would work an hour of work. Now, the problem in recent years, and this is going on in Missouri, is that there have been initiative petitions to push the minimum wage higher. And so we're into that process that passed, and now we're going to see the minimum wage going up periodically. But he also mentions, when the ones that are most negatively affected by minimum wage are young workers or those new to the workforce because they don't have the skills and the talents necessary to justify the higher wage.
Yeah.
And so you'll just have less of them. And now with automation, because he doesn't mention automation too much, but automation, is replacing our service industry entry level jobs. Right now, everybody talks about McDonald's and the fast food joints. I think those are there to stay. I don't know about the self checkouts at grocery stores because we, the thieving public, have access to the product. Yeah. But before we pay for it, and we're self-regulating, whether we're actually going to accurately pay for the...
Well, it's all right. You have one 18-year-old kid standing there kind of vaguely watching 15 different self-checkout lanes. So he's got it covered. There would be no theft occurring.
Well, I will say this. The videos at those registers, there's a camera on every register, and looking down and looking at what you're bagging. So I think there's at least 3 cameras continuously recording every transaction. So it's Big Brother for sure, and they're really high quality. I know this because I'm a prosecutor of a municipality where you have a Walmart, and they review all that stuff. Yeah, and we do issue charges against people later, and they're like, well. And they complain, well, I didn't steal that. I wasn't cited for stealing because we notified them later after it's revealed. And like, well, here's the video of you stealing it. You see how there's beep, 5 things going to the bag, beep, or there's, here's a beep, there's a candy bar as they're throwing, like a $300 piece of electronics. Of course, you can't do that because they have it all locked up if it's anything worth more than $50, but they change the UPC codes on them, and so you can still prosecute, but the volume is too much. Yeah. So I think I don't know if that experiment's going to really continue because it is based upon a society of trust, honesty, and hard work, and there's too high a percentage of people willing to steal. Yeah. And once you get to a certain point, it's not cost effective to not have pay the employees. Yeah. You might as well just pay the employees and say, screw it, wait in line. Yeah. But the fast food kiosks make a lot of sense because it's just like the apps, ordering it online, and then you don't have access to the food until after you paid it. Yeah. And you're only going to get what you've actually ordered and paid. So that makes a lot of sense. I think they need to automate the delivery of the items to you, like either to your location or on a conveyor belt or something, because they're still paying somebody to bring the food out. Yeah, and but they're going to do that at some point. Well, there's a business. It was a guy on a podcast I was listening to a couple of months ago. That is, it's a combination of that kind of app ordering, electronic ordering, with like Uber Eats. And so it's good in like more urban areas where you have one location and you have 30 restaurant type facilities with kitchens and all that kind of stuff, automating everything.
Yeah, I've seen those. Those are kind of spooky. Yeah. They call them ghost kitchens because there's like just not really anybody working there. Correct. And you'll have like 30 different businesses registered at the same location. Yes. And sometimes the menu will just be kind of the same, but you order from technically different restaurants. Yes. And it's all just using the same sort of ingredients and just prepared and then sent to you by a driver. There's no actual physical restaurant that you can ever walk into. Yes. Like there's no dine-in anywhere. It's ghost kitchens, what they call them. It's really interesting.
And then when they get drone delivery, they cut out the delivery guys.
That's true. Yeah, which is, I'm sure, coming at some point.
So bringing it back to the minimum wage laws, as you push up the cost of then they're unskilled labor. I mean, I used to work in unskilled jobs, long ago, and you've worked in retail, couple, unskilled jobs.
I worked restaurant. I've worked food.
It's not to denigrate that work. I mean, all work, honest work, is worthy, But if it's too expensive and there's a way to automate it that will cut those costs and cut out the headaches of management, those machines don't call in sick.
Yeah, because that's the first point he makes here is not necessarily automation, but he's saying, if costs are too high for something, that just generates a surplus. People aren't going to buy it. You're going to have too much of it that you can't sell. It's the same thing with labor. If the cost of labor is too high, we're just going to have a bunch of people who aren't employed. Unemployment is a kind of surplus. We don't think of it in the same terms necessarily, but that is what it is.
Yes.
And he picks out the examples of Switzerland and Hong Kong, who have been, the sort of industrialized societies who did not have minimum wage laws, and they had very low rates of unemployment.
Yes.
But then when Hong Kong introduced a minimum wage, then the rates of unemployment skyrocketed from where they were before. He's saying, we made the cost too high. Now there's a surplus because people aren't willing to buy that labor. People aren't willing to pay for that, and now we have too many people who are unemployed.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of funny. I think he's won the argument among people who study it. I think, and he and others like him, that raising the minimum wage necessarily increases unemployment and necessarily negatively impacts younger workers and negatively impacts in America, the African American population, which is slightly disproportionately less skilled or in the workforce. I don't mean that as a denigration. I think it's just statistically the case that the minimum wage laws do affect that population more, and I think they've won that argument. But the policymakers and the public certainly doesn't see any downside. And then there's the other issue, which I don't think he discusses, which is price inflation. And I think he does mention it because he mentions a short-term gain when you increase the minimum wage for those workers, because there's going to be a gap there where they get paid more, but then the prices have to catch up to it. So all the things that you're buying are going to end up catching up to your new wage, and now you're back where you started. Yeah. And
I think the reason that the public or policymakers haven't kind of caught on is exactly what he's talking about in the section before this. Is it's so easy to make a moral argument out of it. Yeah. Like, isn't it so awful that we're paying these people this little and they can't afford X, Y, and Z? And again, kind of using a statistical group to make it seem like actual individuals rather than a group of people who might work in that minimum wage job and then move on to something else within a year or two. Right. Things like that, where it's like, well, look at these horrible, poor, downtrodden people who can't afford the nice new TV or something like that. And it's like, well, we should bump that up and help them out. Yeah. But it's like, well, it's not really how it works in practice. Like, that sounds nice, but we can't just artificially increase the price of labor and just not have any other effects come out of it. Yeah.
Well, and people will say, advocating for it, similar to what you're talking about, is, well, how can you support yourself or a family on this minimum wage? It's only X dollars. Well, that's not who's making the minimum wage, or not should be making the minimum wage. If you got a family and you're in your 30s, you should not be anywhere near the minimum wage. You should be much higher than that. Yeah. What we're really talking about is teenagers entering the workforce. We're talking about college students, working part-time jobs, or people, re-entering the workforce at part-time jobs. That's really primarily what we're talking about is those truly entry-level positions. Even when the people are just coming on to the full-time workforce, you're talking about minimum wage, and then you're going to earn raises. And if you become in a management or some sort of supervisor or some other skill, it's not, the minimum wage is never going to affect you. Yeah. So it's
I also see with sort of the moral arguments about it is people have this idea of like it's going to be a transfer of wealth from those rich people to the poorer people. Yeah. You see that a lot with like Amazon. It's like, well, Jeff Bezos makes this amount of money and he has these yachts and this big mansion. Right. Why can't he pay his workers more? And it's like, well, if you raise the cost, that's not just pulling from Jeff Bezos's like treasury of gold coins that he has somewhere. Right. That's not really how that works. It's like that's coming from Amazon, and a lot of Bezos's wealth is in assets and stuff like that. And you can't just force him to sell all of that to raise the wages of people by 3 cents when it averages out to his whole company. It's like that's not how that works. But I think a lot of people envision it that way. Is it's in a company. If you raise the minimum wage laws, that just pulls down the wages of those higher up and sort of evens them out among everybody else. But that's just not how it works in practice.
It can happen. That's right.
Exactly. Any other thoughts on the minimum wage?
No.
All right. The last article here in the economics section, I thought this one was the most interesting.
Really? I thought it was the least interesting.
Yeah, well, I'm not as interested in the sort of statistics, like actual economics type stuff. This one's a more, I guess, sort of philosophical one, so that the role of economics. And
Share your thoughts.
Well, I thought it was interesting. His two questions are, is economics scientific, or is it just a set of opinions and ideological biases? And do economic ideas reflect surrounding circumstances and events and change with those circumstances and events? The question, like, really he's asking is it scientific? Or is it just the bias of people who are sort of putting their own spin on things and using statistics to make it seem like what they want it to be?
Yes.
And his main point here is that economics is testable, right? You can have a hypothesis and you can test it. That makes it a science, basically. And he's saying people kind of treat economics unfairly as sort of this, pseudoscience sometimes because, you have these different schools of thought and they try to explain things in different ways. It's like, well, look, they can't agree. Therefore, it doesn't actually exist because they don't have the same, set of principles and stuff like that. Well, it's like, well, no, it does exist in a way because we can test those. We could see if they work out and things like that. He's like, well,
that's the benefit of having these other experiments in other countries, especially.
Yeah.
Where you see somebody decides, oh, we're going to double the minimum wage, and this is going to be great. And then we watch the effects, or price controls. Like you mentioned in a previous, we talked about a previous episode. Oh, it's institute price controls. Some people say that'll work to reduce the cost for the poor. They'll be able to get more bread. Let's see how that works out. That's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see how that works out. And of course, people starve. Yeah. And so, anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I mean, it kind of draws the comparison to like weather forecasting with meteorology. Like we see that as a science.
I don't. You do?
Well, I mean, that's what he says.
Okay, do you?
I mean, vaguely, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's based on scientific principles for sure.
Yes.
Because what he's saying is...
It's not accurate.
Yeah.
But within a certain range.
Exactly, and that's what he's saying. Is It's like you're not saying there's a 100% chance that it'll rain tomorrow. He's saying, like, we can look at these different weather patterns. We can see, like, physically, this is what happens when hot air meets cold air and these things happen. Therefore, we can predict X percentage of how likely rain is to occur.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, that's a scientific process.
Yeah, and
he's saying that is what's
economics.
happening in economics. We're not saying that if we raise the minimum wage law, then specifically, 500,000 people are going to be unemployed. That's not what economics is trying to do. That's what people think economists are saying. He's saying, no, this is the likelihood. This is a likely outcome based on the scientific principles that we have. And therefore, this is a likely outcome of what this proposed policy is going to be.
Yeah.
Similar to scientific process in a similar way to meteorology.
Yeah. And it makes sense. Now you explain it that way because, there's so many variables involved in the weather. And there's so many variables involved, maybe trillions of decisions that are made in the economy. And so if it's similar to like the temperature and the wind speed and all that stuff in the weather, when you look at these, for instance, the minimum wage and unemployment percentage and all that stuff, you put those principles in and you evaluate, okay, if we do X on a big scale, it's going to go up or down, so that's a good point. Yeah.
And I like what he says. He's kind of like anticipating criticisms here. He's like, well, a lot of people view economics as too simplistic, right? So we're trying to simplify all those trillions of decisions and make it a very neat category. What he's saying is, well, the good economists shouldn't be doing that. Certainly there are bad economists that try to say, like, if you do this, then this bad thing will happen.
Yes.
He's saying, no, we're looking at the historical record. We can compare these things here. We could say, sometimes with humility, we're not 100% sure, but we can make this somewhat accurate prediction based on what we know already. And that is the role of the economist, not to just, assert things as if they're going to happen, as if they're, divine, arbiters of the market, I guess.
He does mention your favorite philosopher, political theorist, economist Karl Marx.
Yeah, I'm a big communist. But he even says, like, Karl Marx and Adam Smith agree, in these sorts of ways. Because he says, economics is ultimately about systemic results, not personal intentions. Because that's another big, problem here is that you which end of sort of the carriage you're looking at. You're putting the cart before the horse. Or you're looking at the intentions rather than the outcomes. He says, Karl Marx said that capitalists lower their prices when technological advances lower their cost of production, not because they want to, but because market competition forces them to. And then Adam Smith also says that, essentially the same thing.
Correct.
Because it's like, it's just part of the system. We're not looking at what the individual, CEOs are trying to do. Bringing it into current events, that's a big mistake that a lot of people are making, with the assassination, really, is the killing of that CEO of United Healthcare. Is they're seeing well, this is what this CEO wanted to do. He wanted to deny people, coverage to healthcare. And that's how people are viewing it. It's not really. That's not what any CEO of any healthcare company, I think, really sets out to do. He's not saying, we need to deny this person healthcare coverage. But it's...
I don't know that I think that might be an overstatement. I think, people misunderstand the role of insurance.
Yeah.
And I explain this to people because I handle personal injury claims, and people get emotionally tied up with blaming, and maybe I shouldn't try to do this because they're emotionally tied up about the insurance company. But the insurance companies are not in the business of paying claims.
Yeah.
They're in the business of collecting premiums and not paying claims, right? Because if you're in the business of paying claims, you're going to go out of business because you have to generate more revenue and premiums than you do paying out claims. Yeah. So if they have a system to try to reduce illegitimate claims and try to cut costs in the claims process, that's a legitimate business focus for an insurance company. Now, how they do it, if there's a breach of a contract, but they're so regulated, and they're subject to litigation at all levels with regard to denying claims. It's a breach of contract claim, and it's at the basics of it. And so these people that say, well, and they're not in the healthcare field. Yeah. So if you're really upset about them, it's really the problem with the doctor, because the doctor's saying, I'm not going to provide you with this essential medical care because someone won't pay me a whole lot of money to do it. Yeah. Well, wait a second. Which one's really morally at fault? The doctor who is actually in the room with you saying you need this and I can provide it to you without too much inconvenience in this one particular case. But I won't do it unless this third party pays me a ton of money. Yeah. But this third party won't pay me a ton of money, so you're out of luck, mister. And they're saying it to your face. Yeah. But because the doctor's nice and you need the doctor to provide that service, you don't blame the doctor. Why aren't we blaming the doctor? Yeah. Why don't they do it for free?
Yeah. I mean, I think they also think that, but so much more the anger is it's again, that's idea of where we're
corporate greed.
Yeah, exactly. It's the intentions. You're trying to measure the market by the intentions of the United Healthcare CEO, who nobody knew up until a few weeks ago.
Right. He became nobody not in the industry. I think he might have been speaking at that event, but what? Yeah.
But it's like all of a sudden, all of these leftists are like, we killed this horrible evil man. It's like you didn't even know who this guy was 3 weeks ago. But it's so easy to put like these moral arguments onto these figures, and it's terrible.
Yes, correct. Yes. Good point.
Thank you. Do you have any other final thoughts on this?
No, I think ending a Christmas Eve episode.
Merry Christmas, everybody.
Discussing the assassination of an innocent person and how we all should hate our doctors. I'm just joking. That's not the message. I'm just joking. But I mean, it's, and the reason why we don't expect the doctor to do it for free because we expect, the doctor's got to make a living. Well, so does the insurance company. If we're going to have insurance, the company is involved, then at some point there's going to be a tension there. Yeah. And grow up. It's just so childish. Oh, I want it for free. And all the protesters, I mean, other than being physically repulsive, all seem to be excessively overweight. I mean, I'm a heavy guy now, because I've been lazy and eating too much. But my God, they shouldn't be complaining. They would be, they need to help out with their own health care.
That's a good message.
They need to take care of their health. That's my inspirational message for Christmas.
Merry Christmas, everybody.
Merry Christmas.
That's great. Yeah. Any other final thoughts, or should I not even open?
You keep asking. I'm in a mood. No, I'm nothing but peace and goodwill and love to everyone across podcast land.
All right, that was heartfelt. Season 10, episode 5 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
Merry Christmas.
Yes.
Ridiculous.